Alright, so let's look at some of the mid-range type swords that I have. I'm going to actually start with the stage steel style swords. So I actually, when I learned better about stainless steel and decorative swords, the first brand I came across that I really liked the way they looked, and I thought I knew enough about construction of swords and properties of swords, what makes a sword really great, to think that they were like the end all be all of swords, and that is Starfire Swords. I still really like the look of them. I like simple designs. I've said that many times in my reviews. And I like the simple design of their swords, but they're really heavy, they're really thick blades. The steel's good enough, it's tempered and heat treated properly, but they're just not really all that functional. They are good stage steel swords. So I have their big meter long two-handed sword. I have one of their daggers. Over in the corner I have one of their 32-inch long swords. And I also have a rigid broadsword from them. So I actually own 4 items that are Starfire swords, but I don't really consider them to be all that great anymore. So I own them because I like owning my swords, but I don't think I'd ever buy a Starfire sword again. I got other things I would really want to spend the money on. So that's it for kind of the low mid-end. And then we can begin to talk about kind of the real swords I have. So real quick, I'll just show you this one. It's the only katana I own. This is a Sword Buyer's Guide custom katana. They have a forge that is based out of China, and you get to decide all the design features of the blade. And so I have. It's a fairly decent sword. It's properly constructed and properly weighted. And it's relatively expensive, but not too bad. It's definitely the low end as far as katanas go. And I'm not a big fan of Eastern swords, so I was perfectly happy with getting one that was custom made the way I would want it and just leaving it at that. In the future, maybe when I get more bored and I have way more medieval European swords than I would ever care to buy more of, then maybe I would move on to buying more Eastern and Middle Eastern influenced weapons, but I'm still pretty much going after all the European swords, as it were. Some other swords that are kind of the mid-range in terms of quality. I have a lot of windless swords, like this is a windless Brandenburg rapier. So speaking a little bit to how these swords are good, right? They have the flexibility, and they're strong, and they retain their edge. And that's important, again, for swords like this. You don't really bend a katana like the one I just showed you. It's going to be more rigid, and the steel is going to be a lot harder and have a much more focus on the edge than it would on being able to flex and bend and whatnot. And that's actually speaking a lot to the design that happens to these swords. Historically speaking, European swords would have a lot more flex. I do have a lot of Windless Weapons, again because Museum Replicas is right down the road from me. So I have a little pirate cutlass here. Again, nothing too special. It flexes a bit. It's a pretty thick, rigid blade though, and it's a decent little sword. Again, Windless, pretty good brand if you're wanting to get a lot of variety and not wanting to spend too much money. They're a pretty good brand for that. I also have a Windless Falcata. It's really heavy, but it's a really sturdy construction. It's actually one of the sturdiest constructions I think I've seen in a windless sword, surprisingly. And it's a fairly decent blade. I've never actually used it because I'm not all that comfortable with this one because of the weight. I don't really know how to use it all that well. I've never done a cut test with it. Probably will if I ever do a review of it. Which would be true of any of the swords that I haven't done a review of that you're seeing. I will likely do cut tests with them. Of course, you have seen the ones I have done a review of, the Hanway Claymore and the Ritter Steel Landsknecht. I have them here. I'm not going to bother showing them now. You can go look at the videos. But they're good swords as well. But I am going to show you one more, but I have to go grab it. So, one more sword from Windless that I just got recently, and I'm working on a review of it, is the Windless Accolade sword. It's a pretty nice decorative sword in my opinion. I don't know so much about functionality, but I'll cover that in the review. Again, it's windless though, so it has the flex and rigidity and strength and all that you would really need in a sword. So as you can see, I have a lot more windless swords than anything. A lot of that has to do with their price. I like variety in my swords, and so I buy a lot of windless swords because even though they're not the best quality, I can buy 3 or 4 of them for the price than of one really good sword. It's not to say I don't buy really good swords though. I actually have 3 Albions. One you have seen. That would be the Ringek. I did a review of that. It's actually my most watched video at this point. I really love this sword, and it speaks a lot when I start talking about the quality and the price difference and getting what you pay for. This sword in the hand, this sword functionally is so much greater than anything I have, except for maybe the other Albions I have. It speaks a lot that it's very important that you go for that really good construction. So I'm going to talk about construction of sword with this in hand. So again, you've got a nice blade. This is, I've been told, 1075 high carbon steel. I like that steel. I like it because I like the Albions. It's got a good, nice, solid crossguard, and I've shown it in the review, but of course the construction is very tight. There aren't gaps anywhere where the tang meets everything in the hilt assembly. Of course, the tang of the blade comes all the way through, up through the top of the pommel, and you can actually see a little bit, if I get it right in there, you can see maybe potentially the peen point, but they peen it down and then they really shine it up. So it is peened, it is a solid piece all the way through, and just good solid construction. And so you can't beat an Albion. Certainly, again, Arms and Armor, Christian Fletcher, Fable Blades. I know these guys make great swords. I plan on buying swords from every one of them at some point in the future, but I have a couple of Albions I still want to get. So I'm still working through my Albion phase, as it were, until I get everything that I really want. Another Albion sword that I do own, being a HEMA practitioner, I do actually have one of their Lichtenauer swords. It's a blunt, it's got a little bit of a tip. A lot of the HEMA community, I mean, they recognize that Albions are good swords, but these are actually not usable in a lot of competitions because Albion isn't rolling their tip, so it's still, even though it's blunted, it could still, some people are worried that it could injure them. So this is good for just kind of general practice and use, not so much for tournaments and probably not for full-on fighting, but man, this is a good solid sword. This was the first Albion I bought at the suggestion of my HEMA mentor back in the day, and I like it. It's a good sword. It's solid. So I would definitely advise people to get an Albion Lichtenauer. Only if they really have the money. I would actually, for a HEMA perspective, I would suggest other types of swords, maybe a fader. And I won't speak to HEMA swords today because I do have a lot of HEMA practice swords, and that might be a whole separate video in the future. So I have one other sword that I like to show you because I believe it's kind of the pinnacle of my sword collecting thus far, and it might be the pinnacle forever because I really love this sword, and it speaks a lot to me, so that might be part of it. But you think back to that really crappy stainless steel claymore that I purchased off of eBay 10 years ago. Well, compare that to the Albion Gallo Glass. This is a well-constructed, beautiful sword. It's made again of apparently a 1075 high carbon steel. It's got very similar construction to the Ringek. Of course, good peening. This one has an open pommel, so you can actually see the tang coming up through the center of the pommel to the peen block at the top. This is a beautiful sword. It feels so good. You begin to understand how a good sword differs from a really terrible sword-like object, or even just a really, really raw, basic, functional sword. This one is just amazing. These are truly the Ferraris of swords, and I'm enamored with this one. I love it. But it shows that you know, over 10 years I've been purchasing swords, and there's actually a lot that I haven't shown you. I have, looking over here in the corner, I have a Gladius. I have a Masonic order. It's really like a Knights of Columbus sword. And I have some other various odds and ends that I haven't shown you. I don't think it's necessary to show all of them, but you can see there's been a progression over 10 years. I have slowly refined my understanding of what a good sword is. And I've only been buying Albions recently, only within the past 2 years. Because I was only actually, oddly enough, I was only really aware of them as of a couple of years ago, which is really unfortunate because I wish more people were aware of them. Certainly not just within the sword community. I think the sword community does know about Albion, but I wish people more and more outside of the sword community would be aware of just what a high quality sword really is. And that's really, again, the point of this video, the point of all this, if you're still sticking around at this point, it's not just about Albion, it's about good swords, the Christian Fletchers, the Arms and Armors, the Dark Sword Armories even. A good sword is worth saving up the money for, it's worth waiting for, and I think for a sword collector, I would certainly say I have all these swords, but having one really good sword over having 10 or 15 not so good swords, I'd much rather have just the one. It's worth it. So keep that in mind and remember all the things I've talked about, and certainly I might do follow-up videos to this if I feel like there's things that I've missed speaking to, but hopefully I think you're better prepared to actually go out and start purchasing swords on your own. So good luck in the search. Oh, real quick, before you go, leave a comment down below if there's a certain sword that you saw in this video that you'd like me to do a review of. I'll do my best to prioritize.